so much. Good evening. I'm going to give a brief slideshow before Eric and I sit down to talk about American history for a little while. I wanted to do something in the spirit of the graphics theme of this year's amazing Humanities Festival. And I want to talk a little bit about why I wrote a book about American history. And one reason is that our politics really consists of very brief historical arguments. From the right and from the left, we make arguments about the relationship between the past and the present, between the present and the future, how we oppose arguments, makes counter-arguments about these two things. And I often find myself sympathetic with this one very powerful graphic that I came across at a Tea Party rally in Washington, D.C. But what I want to try to do in a very brief presentation this evening is to give you some sense of why I think it's important that we abandon those ideological partisan arguments in favor of a longer sweeping account of the nation's past and try to get our bearings back. So what I want to do is show for you a series of images of America, of the place that we inhabit. We should just recall that all peoples and all places represent themselves graphically on pieces of paper. Here's this beautiful Aztec, essentially map of the world, or this Algonquin map of the reign of Powhatan and the 30-some tributary villages that paid tribute to him here rendered. Powhatan, the man, of the spirit figure guides on either side, and these circles of tributary villages. Europeans, before 1492, pictured the world this way as divided into three parts, Europe, Africa, and Asia, that were inhabited by the descendants of the three sons of Noah. After Columbus made his voyage in 1492, there was a lot of work for map makers who had to try to figure out how to represent the world differently. And the most famous of these and the most ambitious is this map by Martin Waldseemüller, who offered up the kind of late-breaking news at the last minute he had to adjust his map to account for the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope. But he wanted to indicate this fourth part of the world. If the world had always been three parts before, now it's four, what are you going to do with this fourth part of the world? No one really knows how to represent it. Waldseemüller was really influenced by a book he read by Amerigo Vespucci, so influenced that he put Vespucci up here on his map, and although no one had any idea what to call this blob, Waldseemüller named it America. And this is the first time this landmass is called America. It, of course, appears under that name in many other times and places down to our day, and Vespucci gets a kind of leading credit iconographically in the allegorical representation of America. Here, Vespucci awakening a sleeping America, a naked native woman. You should really think about Vespucci here as kind of the Harvey Weinstein of the Age of Discovery. This is essentially a celebration of Europeans raping America, planting their seed in this fertile land. This is a very different image, a very equally violent image of Queen Elizabeth, Queen of England, resting her hand on a globe, covering North America with her palm at a time when England has no colonies. This is a purely ambitious portrait, but bear it in mind, we'll come across one pretty similar to it in a minute. This will be familiar to you as the famous woodcut that appeared in Benjamin Franklin's newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, arguing that the mainland colonies should form a defensive union. This, though, is also a map. Think about this as a map, a dissected snake as a map of Britain's mainland colonies at a time when the first jigsaw maps were invented. The first jigsaw puzzles were invented. They were called dissected maps. And they were made by map makers who, to try to teach about the political boundaries that were the fictions of nation states, cut maps with a jigsaw and sold them as puzzles. This is something that Franklin is kind of calling upon here, the idea that a land can be cut up, and not just owned, but also cut up. Here's another image of rape. America, again as a native woman here, being raped by British tax collectors in 1774. This is a revolutionary political cartoon. The Constitution of the United States is itself a graphical representation of the relationship between the people in the place. It's an instantiation of the people as founded in a document. By the founding of the early republic, this figure appears liberty, now not a naked native woman, but a clothed European American woman with her liberty cap and this white gown. This image, though, of course, is an indictment of the hypocrisy of liberty in a land of slavery, and introduces another iconic figure who appears again and again and again, who is this woman, an enslaved African woman representing allegorically slavery as against this woman, liberty. You see that woman all the time. Here she is again as Sally Hemings, the African-American woman who was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. Here, the philosophic cock. This is a political cartoon from 1804, the year of his re-election campaign. But notice how Hemings is serving as an indictment here of Jefferson, and also as herself an allegory for America. This image from 1848 is an incredibly powerful representation, celebration of American democracy. All these guys, these white men on this porch of the American hotel can vote. That's why they're reading the political news or having it read to them, the war news from Mexico. And they represent American diversity at that moment. People usually laugh at that, but this is actually a celebration of diversity. These guys are rich and poor, they're immigrant, they're native born, they're city bred, they're country folks, they're bankers, they're farmers. It's an incredible celebration that nowhere else in the world can all white men vote, except for in the American hotel. But it's also an illustration of the limitations of that. Notice this woman, white woman, leaning out the window trying to listen to the political news. 1848 is the year of the first Women's Rights Convention in the United States. And then see these figures here, this black man and his son or daughter who are dressed in such a way as to suggest that they're enslaved. They're not allowed on the porch either. The porch, as it happens, is also rotting, you might notice here. But note too, these two figures, they are the ones in red, white, and blue. It's a really interesting commentary on the limits of American political community. This image from the pre-Civil War era should be familiar to you as our Electoral College map, which is essentially what it is. It is the Electoral College map of the 1850s. It's the first time that that notion of dissecting, these are also sold as jigsaw puzzles, a dissected electoral map showing the states, the free states, including California that just has entered the Union in 1850, the slave states, and then the unorganized territories here. But considering the country in this way, picturing the nation as divided in this way, of course, is very much with us still. Here's Sojourner Truth, a great abolitionist and orator, making her own claim about the United States. It takes a minute to see it, but if you follow the skein, we have Maine, Florida, Texas. Oh! She's making this very powerful claim. She made this country. This is her country. She made it. You get, of course, these familiar iconic images of Manifest Destiny, now liberty flying across the continent, and it's celebrating the Western conquest of Europeans. At the same time, there are forms of criticism, like in this political cartoon, decrying the first immigration restriction law in 1881, restricting Chinese immigrants here. The Chinese are taking down their Great Wall only to have the stones used to build a wall at the western border of the United States by previous ethnic groups who had already entered the country. The Statue of Liberty, also from that era on the East Coast, represents a different vision of American immigration. These dissected maps, these political maps that you can do as jigsaw puzzles, are sold, really widely sold in the 1880s. Here's a box top where we have liberty and America kind of together, this kind of schizophrenic representation of the two. American folk art communicates a lot about America, the idea of America. Here's a suffrage quilt that was used to raise money for the suffrage campaign. Populism has its graphic representation, often a very contemptuous representation by Eastern magazine writers here, representing populism as a balloon made of patches, raggedy patches, so full of hot air and kind of primitive and pathetic. Plutocrats get their iconic representation, especially in the game of Monopoly, but here in Puck Magazine, where this guy is stealing a piggy bank from a toddler. America as a woman, as liberty, is a key iconographic form of political cartoonery of the suffrage movement. Here, the woman, America is breaking off her bonds as women struggle for the right to vote. There's also a lot of anxiety by the progressive era about mass democracy in an age of mass production and the anonymity of these new large numbers of immigrants who have come to the United States and how they have to be assimilated into American ways here at Ford's Dearborn plant, which leads to the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, the National Origins Act, which is advocated for here with this image that we no longer use this allegory of the filter rather than the wall. America as a superpower finds its place in American comic books by the 1840s. Captain America 1940, Captain America 1940, Wonder Woman 1941. At the same time that the United States, of course, has failed to wrestle with the problems of racial inequality after emancipation with the institution of Jim Crow, which by 1941 depicted here in this beautiful Jacob Lawrence portrait, a very different kind of manifest destiny, a different kind of continental vision, the greatest migration in American history, the millions of African Americans who packed their bags and left the Jim Crow South for other parts of the United States. America's ambitions as a superpower, but particularly its role as a leader of the free world, is really very beautifully represented here, which is like a nice counterpoint to that Queen Elizabeth with her, remember when she had her hand on the globe, the imperial conquest that England imagined at that time. Here's FDR's vision of a United Nations with his kind of the Atlas-like burden that he expected the United States to bear in ensuring free markets, open borders, a democratic world order, and self-determination in 1942. Something that would be achieved in part by what FDR called, of course, the arsenal of democracy, America's tremendous military might. But what also came out of that war is the mainframe computer, which would have its own way of representing the American people graphically in the form of what comes out of a computer printer. Here's Walter Cronkite up here looking very Errol Flynn and dashing. The election of 1952 is the first one in which a computer, this is the UNIVAC, was used to predict the outcome. This is a live election night coverage in the Stevenson-Eisenhower campaign of 1952. This notion that the American people would be carried on the shoulders of scientists. Here are MIT engineers wrestling with their computer printouts in 1957, the age of Sputnik, the dawn really of our STEM era, but a very particular vision of what an American superpower must have. A tremendous concern about that anonymity, the data aggregation, how we are being reduced to bits and bytes of information, is expressed in resistance to that vision by some incredibly beautiful works of art, among them this beautiful Jasper Johns map from 1961. Those traditional representations, graphic representations of the United States become central to American political protest during the Vietnam War. Here's a silk screen, a very powerful silk screen from 1970, and they also are part of our bumper sticker sloganeering partisanship that really begins in the 1970s in earnest, even as that is resisted by the environmental movement, which adopts this blue marble photograph as its central icon. The bicentennial elicits a whole new wave of celebration of and also refiguring of the American vision. Here's this beautiful piece of folk art, a quilt by an African-American quilter from Alabama, even before the kind of Rainbow Coalition or the Gay Pride flag that has this vision of the flag as a rainbow, really powerful one. We also, I think, would be ill-advised to overlook the influence of social science representations of the American people as the inhabitants of a place, as a nation. Here's a really interesting representation of the American people from the Second World War to more or less now. I'm just going to suggest to you, I show this mainly to suggest to you that this is a way we think about ourselves, but this is a chart that is tracking two things. Political polarization, which is really low until about 1972 and then has been rising. We're up here now. And income inequality, which was very low. This is the GI Bill in the decades following the Second World War and then has been rising. The relationship between these two curves is something that we could talk about maybe during the Q&A. It's a really interesting question. In the dawn of the opening of the internet to commercial traffic in the 1990s, Wired magazine celebrated celebrated that opening and insisted that all the problems that were represented in this graph would be solved by the internet. I know, which is laughable now. A lot of that vision, that technological utopianism, was criticized, especially by artists. There's this beautiful installation at the Smithsonian. Each state, it's this giant, it's as big as this stage, this map of the United States, and each state is comprised of video screens, monitors that are broadcasting and blaring something about their own state. There's multiple screens in each state. And no matter how close you get or how far away you get, you can hear everything, but you can understand nothing. The whole point of this beautiful work by the Korean-American artist Namjoon Paik is that with the internet, we are all broadcasting, but no one is listening. So I, again, just wanted to suggest to you briefly with this very quick tour through some powerful graphic representations of the idea of America, how much our political history is mobilized for the sake of political argument, but how much is gained by looking at that argument over time, and how so many things that seem unprecedented, including the idea of a wall, subject to a very powerful protest, are in fact precedented. Think about that electoral map and how it haunts us and how it divides us. Think about where that comes from. And who's making a lot of money, actually, by broadcasting it more or less constantly. So I just would close, as Eric and I begin our conversation, by pointing to, I think, one of my most favorite pieces of public art representing the current, I guess one of the questions that came in, the current national nightmare, was how it was phrased, is this neon and this neon sculpture by the African-American artist Glenn Ligon called Double America, one of a series that he produced a few years back. I think attempting to ask us to think about how we can live in a place where to some people up is down. Thanks very much.
That was great. It was fun to sit in the wings and hear the laughter. I think this is a very fun book to read, and congratulations on its publication, and now what seems to be very good reception. We're here at Northwestern today, and the book is long. It's a 800, 900 page book.
200 pages are footnotes. You can skip those.
That's right.
And there's like a lot of illustrations.
One page for every member of the audience. But who's counting? Northwestern is mentioned twice in the book, and so I thought we'd start there.
It's like a quiz. Okay. I'm trying to remember.
No. The first time is in your chapter on reformers and citizenship after the Civil War. And you invoke Frances Willard, who was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and a dean here at Northwestern. And her slogan was, "Do everything." So often in reviews of this book, there is a sense of the incredible audacity of trying to do all of American history within a single compass or within a single book. So can you talk about whether "do everything" is a good slogan for this book or not?
I concede that it was audacious, but I by no means did everything. It's a very selective account in the sense that it's my sense that it's my obligation in a book like this or any book to organize my discoveries such that they can be rendered not only comprehensible to, but ideally delightful to a reader. I'm a big believer in delight, which is not to say, because delight can mean sorrow. I mean, it doesn't mean the book's going to make you happy. I'm not going to promise the book's going to make you happy, so there's a lot of decisions behind doing that. So yes, do everything in the sense that it would be important. I thought it was important for someone to sit down and try to write a book like this, to try to do it in a fair-minded and broad-minded and scholarly way, but that was really devoted to capturing and maintaining a reader's interest.
Okay. The second reference to Northwestern is to a professor of journalism here in the early 1930s, who left in 1932 for Princeton, where he developed a laboratory that involved the measuring of public opinion, and is sort of known to be the father of political polling, and that's George Gallup, professor, I think, at Medill in the 1930s. You don't take all that much delight in George Gallup, I think, or in political polling in general. And so, do you want to say, is Gallup one of your antagonists in the larger story? This is very much a book about the collision, as you were saying at the end, between politics and versions of social science.
Yeah, I think that Gallup is not a bad man or something, and I don't attempt to paint him, and I don't have any sense of Gallup as a man. But as a salesman, what he was selling, I think, came out of the very good intention in the 1930s to think about how to resist fascism. And the fascism is when the state tells the people what to believe. And Gallup believed that he could use some of the same tools, that is largely the tools of social science, which a lot of fascists were using as well. The best social science was coming out of Germany, and that those tools could be used to help democracy work better by amplifying the voice of the people so that elected officials could listen to it better, that they could know the will of the people at all. That if fascism is about amplifying the voice of political leaders, that polling would be about amplifying the voice of the people. That's the spirit in which he undertakes and markets Witty. America Talks is the name of his column, is the syndicated newspaper column. There are a few different problems with what Gallup is doing that have been pointed out by many people from the very start of when so-called scientific polling began, that are just generally set aside with each generation. And it really bothers me that they're set aside. So one is that Gallup didn't actually measure the opinions of the American people. He measured the opinions to the degree that he could of people that he believed would vote. So for instance, he routinely did not poll blacks in the South because under Jim Crow, it would be very difficult for them to vote. He routinely did not poll about civil rights questions because he had a national syndication, and Southern newspapers said that if he asked questions about civil rights, they wouldn't run his column anymore. So what he does is claim to have this incredible mandate of the people that he is offering to the public. You're telling the people what people believe, and it's just riddled with all kinds of problems that are propagating existing and actually exacerbating existing political inequalities. And then the other thing that I spend some time on the subject in the book is that the premise behind the kind of polling that we do now it rests on a misunderstanding of how our government works. We don't have delegates. The people that we elect to go to Congress aren't there to actually do what we tell them to do. They're there to represent our interests. And pollsters would seem to suggest that what we're asking people to do is do what we tell them to do. We live in an incredibly, I don't know what the adjectival form of plebiscite is, but the way sort of that we think about, like Twitter actually, like people could just decide how to vote on an issue based on what tended to be trending on Twitter. That's exactly the opposite of how our government is set up, and it's a kind of an outgrowth of polling.
Yeah. Okay, we've satisfied the local questions.
Okay.
And now we can talk much more about the book, but I wanted to give you a chance to sort of show the way in which this is really a book full of biographies of different individuals. So you began your career as a historian of a little-known war that I don't think many people in the audience may have heard of, or they would have certainly.
Show of hands, King Philip's War.
Sure.
Okay, little known. You're right.
Readers of your book will only hear about it in, I think, a single sentence. So
Also of little significance.
No. But I guess I wanted to ask you how you went from being a historian of a little-known war that few had heard of, and you were really more of a historian of the discourse around the war, and sort of the ways in which that ran through U.S. history up through the present. But how did you prepare yourself to do this? I've read or heard interviews where you talk about working chronologically, checking out the books. And so what was the process of writing a book like this?
Well, I wouldn't have been able to write this book 10 or certainly not 20 years ago, or whenever it was that I wrote that first, that book about King Philip's War was my dissertation. It was the first book I wrote in the middle of the 1990s. And ever since then, I've been, of course, teaching American history and also writing essays. And I want to emphasize that because the teaching, which broadens your scope always, because you're not only responsible for what you're teaching, but also for all the questions that people ask you. But also, I've been writing for The New Yorker since 2005, and very early on, I went to meet my editor, who I only knew by email, to say, I'd really like a little bit more work, I really love this kind of work, I have a big appetite for it, I'm kind of tireless about it, I won't turn down anything. But I am, I'm a 17th century American historian. and
it opens a lot of doors.
And he said, you'd be surprised how little interest there is in 17th. So he said, would you write about the 18th century? And I said, I think I could do that safely, Well, what about the 19th century? Maybe, and so this sort of, it emerged that if I wanted to write for a general interest magazine, I needed to be willing to write about all of American history, and academic specialty be damned. And I think actually it turns out, as a fellow early Americanist, I'm hoping you might agree with this supposition, but I think if I had been trained as a, if my work was about 1968 to the present, and then I tried to do something that started, in 1492, it would have been a disaster. Or even trying to write those essays, trying to cover, do a good book review of a book about the 16th century or something. It's much harder. It's actually harder to do the work in the early period. The language is different. The archive is scant. The material is more difficult to work with. The world is more foreign. So the more you move chronologically in time toward the present, I think the easier it gets. You don't see a lot of people who start out, whose first book was a biography of Ronald Reagan, who go on to do something that has big chronological sweep that's very difficult. Or most of the popular biographies that you read are actually written not by historians, but by journalists anyway, who couldn't do that sweep. So for me, the easy part of the book was up to the Civil War, and then it gets tricky. But the process was just okay, write the chapter outline and then figure out a list of books I need for each chapter, order them from the library, put them in a stack, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, read them, send them back to the library, write the chapter, read the next pile, send them back to the library, write the chapter. It's that.
No, it's heroic.
I took a picture of the books once because my editor was like, how's the book coming along? I was like, you gotta see, I'm over here, and I gotta get to there.
So one thing that I love about this book, even as a professional historian, is that it's not obsessed with the history of history or historiography, but it is obsessed with historians as characters in this book. And there are many times when you will turn and reflect upon one of your progenitors, whether it's George Bancroft or Woodrow Wilson, somebody who has had, again, the audacity to try to write a general history of the United States. And the historians appear in every chapter: Richard Hofstadter, Alan Nevins, Charles and Mary Beard. And I'm kind of curious what you think the role the historian should play now is compared to these earlier versions of public intellectuals.
Well, I guess I included those people as characters almost incidentally. It happens that all of them were indeed famous for something else. So George Bancroft was the Secretary of War. Woodrow Wilson?
Yeah. What did he do after he wrote that?
Yeah. Theodore Roosevelt, who wrote The History of the West. Frederick Douglass, I think he should be understood as a historian, was better known as other things. W.B. Du Bois, better known for other things. I guess Charles and Mary Beard. By the time you get to the 20th century, Turner really was just a historian, merely a historian.
Merely a historian.
Yeah, by the time you get, and that itself is interesting, right? That those people, all they are doing, by the time of the modern research university, or the land-grant university in the case of Turner, they're working as historians. That's what they do. Until you get to Arthur Schlesinger, who was famously kicked out of my department after he took a year to work in the Kennedy administration because historians weren't supposed to do something other than be historians. So mainly those people are in the book because they're doing other things, but I guess you can use them as a way to observe the narrowing of the role of the historian. To the point where when you, I don't think that after Hofstadter there probably is a historian in my account, because there really isn't anybody after Hofstadter who is known in that same way, maybe. So what do I think the current role of the historian is? We're doing it.
You're right.
You and I, we're here doing this right now.
But you say in the book that it's not to be, it's not to criticize, it's not to moralize. So what is the proper, proper province of the historian now?
I'll say what I think it is not. I don't think the proper role of the historian, or the best and most helpful thing a historian can do, is serve as a political commentator. And that is mostly what we are called upon to do, if we are ever called upon to do anything. I mean, generally what happens if you we're just generally considered useless.
You have 900 people here.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you very much. That's because I'm also going to be president of the United States. So that's I'm Wilson and I started out in the academy.
I'll write the inaugural. No, you'll write it.
No. What was I saying? How we're useless. Oh, you know what you'll see? Where you see historians, you know, well, I'm not even going to tell that story. But when you watch television or you read the newspaper, you see basically three historians. And they come on the stage and they say, I have a funny story about FDR. Or they'll say, I have a very illuminating and dark tale about LBJ that forebodes our times. And like, that's it. Like, there's some presidential anecdote. And they're like court jesters. I mean, and it's not that they're bad people, but like, it's actually, I think that's fairly terrifying use of an intellectual, right? Like, we're just there to say, it's been this bad before, don't worry, or, oh my God, worry. And as if, like, that's what we do. Like, that's, like, think about your training and the method and the discipline and evidence, and that's just, you could pull anybody off the street to say that. Like, it's really troubling to me. So I don't think that is actually the best role. And I think that, in general, certainly my generation and the generation that trained me refused to engage in any kind of public commentary because that was so debased. And it had been debased in particular by Vietnam. Because in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War, social scientists worked for McNamara and were part of getting us into Vietnam and keeping us in Vietnam as long as we were. And then there were a lot of social scientists who were very opposed to Vietnam and were part of the protests against Vietnam. And kind of at the end of it, a lot of scholars were like, you know what, we should just actually not be involved. Like, we should just not, we should act as citizens and as activists, or we should be scholars, but it's a mess out there. And what we say will be demeaned and simplified. And so when I was being trained, it was a huge, big thing. You should never, like, the specific instruction, never write an op-ed, never go on the radio. Like, you can't do these things and still be a serious person. And largely that is unfortunately true, because when you're on those not so much the radio, I would say, but certainly on TV, we were just talking about this earlier, it's very hard to be a serious person on television. It's not actually a serious medium right now.
And
no one's recording this yet.
No one's recording it for future broadcast. So another thing that I really appreciate about this book, I think that often when you talk to a historian and you ask a question, you know, what was the cause of the Civil War, what was the cause of the American Revolution, there's usually a sigh, and then a sense like, well, it's pretty complex, you know. But in this, and I don't think that you deny the complexity of American history, but there is a kind of attention and clarity. So this is a chance for us to talk about the three truths that you identify as the truths of American history. You also have, you at least nominate one question as the animating question that runs throughout American history and also through this book. I don't think people have to buy the book to know what the question is or what the three topics are, but you didn't mention them, so I wanted to give you a chance to say.
Yeah, I mean, the way I organized the book was to say that it would be useful for us to reacquaint ourselves with the notion that the United States is a nation founded on a set of ideas. It is not a nation that is founded on a shared ethnic heritage or even a shared language, not really a shared history. It's a nation that is founded on a set of shared ideas that, are identified by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence as these truths that we hold to be self-evident: political equality, natural rights, and the sovereignty of the people. And if we no longer hold those ideas in common, then we actually don't have a nation anymore. So it's useful to think about those ideas and to figure out where did they come from and are they true? So the way the book is organized, a whole long stretch of it is, where did those ideas come from? They don't come from nowhere. They don't come from Thomas Jefferson. Where do they come from? And then really the rest of the book is like, kind of, are they true? And do we still believe them? So that's kind of how the book is organized. And it also asks us to remember that the unwritten truth is inquiry. Like, actually, it is our job in a republic to figure out what's true. Inquiry is a foundational American value, the art of inquiring into the truth of the matter so that as citizens we can exercise our suffrage responsibly and with a public interest in mind. And that the United States is, therefore, and was understood by its framers and its founders as an Enlightenment experiment. And as Alexander Hamilton says in the first Federalist paper, it is fallen upon the people of the United States to decide to answer this really intriguing question. If, in the whole history of humanity, it is possible for people to design a government by which they can rule themselves justly and as equals with the exercise of reason and choice, instead of succumbing to the fate of every other government in the history of humanity, of succumbing to accident and force. That is a kind of crappy paraphrase of Hamilton's first Federalist paper.
It's in the book.
But it's in the book. But that is, that's to Hamilton, that's the question. Like, here's an experiment. We have this idea. What if we tried to do this? No one else has ever succeeded before. And I avoid answering that question. I point out moments when people ask it very explicitly, because it comes up again and again and again in American history.
I have to cross that one off then. So is it reflection and choice or accident and force?
I have my students debate that question all the time, because it's a good debate. But the point is, when you go on a long car trip with your kids and they're like, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And you're like, look, we're just passing through the Painted Mountains. Isn't that beautiful? And they're like, are we there yet? Like, no, but it's the journey. It's the question. It's not the answer.
Yeah. Well, what's nice about that is that Jefferson gives you your title and Hamilton gives you your animating question, and that's a very balanced way. It seems like in a partisan sense, and I think we want to land on partisanship at some point. But so this is a book that has a lot to say about religion, which kind of differentiates it from a lot of single-volume histories and a lot of histories out there. And there's something called the page 99 test. Have you ever done this with any of your books? You open to page 99 and get a good sense of what the book is about, because authors often pay more attention to the introduction or the conclusion, so to really get a sense. So can you guess what you're talking about on page 99?
I think we probably haven't got out of the 17th century yet.
No, you're absolutely. I'll show it to you here. It's. I'm
going to fail the page 99.
No, you can't fail it. No, you succeed beautifully.
I think you should get a free meal at a steakhouse if you.
Read the first sentence on page 99 here.
Okay. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, Jefferson began, that all men are created equal.
It's a pretty good representation of what you're going to get, ending at the bottom of the page with the Jamaican slave revolt.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's a great passage. But so the question is, if the Committee of Five hadn't revised Jefferson's original language from "we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable" to "self-evident," what would the effect have been?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good illustration of just the contingency of history, right? I mean, it wouldn't have meant anything different to the people who wrote it, but it would have meant all the difference in the world to subsequent generations in the 19th century and the 20th century, yeah. I mean, one reason there is so much religion in the book is that, there's a lot of religion in American history. Yeah. But also, it has been pretty aggressively stripped out of a lot of historical writing by generations of fairly secular academic historians. And I wanted to, I wanted to be part of the solution to that problem. And so spent a lot of time thinking about where to really emphasize the religious influence on American politics. It's really a political and intellectual history. So I'm looking for moments where changes in religious belief or changes in religious practice have an effect on political arrangements.
Yeah. So most, this is a pacing question, but most histories of the United States, most surveys of the United States sort of break down right at the Civil War. Sort of up to the Civil War is Volume 1, and Reconstruction and after is Volume 2. In a 900-page book, you're done with the Civil War at about page 300, which means that the center of the book ends up following much later than it does in a lot of histories. In fact, the 1910s, if we would look at the exact center point, I can show you. The exact center point is going to be the 1912 election, so about 100 years ago.
Oh, that's interesting.
And in fact, there's a photograph of a suffragette parade in New York on that page. I'll have to find it. It doesn't really matter. But I guess I wanted to ask you what you think the center of American history is. Because I think we're going to have some questions from the audience pretty soon that they've sent in about the sort of more recent past. But when you were working your way through and thinking, am I there yet? What?
Well, when you write a biography and you're just waiting for the person to die? This had a little bit of that quality to it.
Did the United States die?
There's a lingering illness. I should explain that I was first asked by Norton, my publisher, to write a college textbook. And I said, sure, I'm happy to do that, so long as you're willing to publish a book that is in my voice and not in the voice of a textbook writer. And also, so long as you're willing to wait, because I actually think the reading public needs this book more. There are plenty of other college textbooks. They're really different than this book. So I wrote this book first, and actually this summer, before the book came out, I revised this book into the textbook. And in the textbook, it divides much more half and half at the Civil War, because they asked for that. They wanted basically quite a bit more. They wanted the colonial period divided into like 4 different sections. But writing it for the general reader, I'm assuming people really don't want to hear all that much about William Penn and the founding of Pennsylvania, or, there are kind of nods to key moments there, but I also did want there to be a lot of momentum. I wanted the political issues to become recognizable fairly quickly to people, and that happens by the Jacksonian period, I would say. So there are, the textbook looks quite different. I took out 40,000 words and I put in 30,000 more words in there, just differently arranged. Where do I think the hinge is of American history? I might choose 1896, which is pretty close to my 1912 point. And at a certain point, when people teach the U.S. History Survey, which now is always divided at the Civil War, I think it should be divided at 1896. Like, we have a lot to cover from 1896 to the present. What happens when you teach that second part? That you have to start in 1865, and you never really get past Reagan, or maybe you don't even get past Vietnam, or like there's always a problem. Certainly for high school kids, it's really hard the way they kind of work that year out. I think 1896 is a really, really important moment. It's Plessy v. Ferguson, the segregation, Supreme Court ruling about upholding Jim Crow segregation. It's the election that realigns the Democratic and Republican parties. It's the first federal election. This is a bad thing to say today, but it's the first US federal election where no one is killed at the polls. We've had some successful ones since then. Let's try to keep that record going. But it's the first election of the secret ballot nationwide.
Yeah. So we'll move to the audience questions in just a second. I wanted to ask you finally, there's a persistent theme in the book about what will save the Republic. And Madison thinks it's going to be the newspaper, and maybe the age of Lincoln thinks it's going to be the telegraph, and the age of FDR thinks it's going to be the radio, and the age of Nixon thinks it's going to be the television, and we think it's going to be the internet. So you kind of give us this little pocket histories of this relationship between democracy and media, saying occasionally that, yes, Madison was right, and yet terribly wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so can you say a little bit about what made them right and what made them wrong, and maybe ending with the internet?
Yeah, I think we forget how much of our political system is not in the Constitution, but is later adaptations. So including the party system, including judicial review, and big things about how we arrange ourselves politically, including the Bill of Rights, which is not initially in the Constitution. So, but what happens very quickly after the ratification of the Constitution is that people who are paying attention, above all, someone like Madison, realize this experiment, like already it needs some tinkering. Like it's not quite working. Like if you're going to have parties, then if they knew they were going to have parties, they probably would have arranged the federal government slightly differently. They certainly have to already figure out, they have to pass the 12th Amendment about the separation of the vice president and the presidential elections. So they're already realizing there's some problems, and because that realization happens at the moment of the emergence of technological determinism in the great age of machines in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when people are beginning to think about progress in purely technological terms, that even Madison is already beginning to think that way. Well, what will fix this is the newspaper, because the newspaper will circulate around the country like blood. And then then the country seems to be falling apart by section. Oh, well, the telegraph will hold us together. And it becomes a habit to think of a technological patch for a political problem, which is always just failing to solve the political problem. And it just keeps postponing any real confrontation with the political problem itself, which is the problem of disunion. And the only one of those technologies that I think actually, at least for a while, goes some ways towards solving that problem, or at least mitigating it, is the radio, which I think is a very unionizing technology because of the way it's managed by Hoover, because of the way the Federal Radio Commission is set up in 1927, the Federal Radio Act. The very opposite is the case with the internet, which is organized basically by anarchists. I mean, libertarians would be at the outside of that anarchist body of people who decide that the reason for PayPal is, Peter Thiel doesn't believe in government. Like he believes there should be currency that is outside the control of government. Like the whole idea behind that early campaign that leads in 1996 to the Telecommunications Act is the internet should be beyond the realm of government control because it is the organizing form of communication for a post-governmental world. And that turns out to be only too true.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to some questions from the audience. We have quite a few here, and I'm not sure how many we'll get through. The first one comes from Kimberly, and it's a question about how your perspective on being a historian has changed over time, some of which we've talked about, but more particularly what advice you have for new historians who are currently in graduate school.
Good luck. Have you thought about law school? When I was in graduate school, I was taught that something that was very important for you to do, in addition to not be engaged in public conversations, was in the classroom to abdicate your authority. This was part of a feminist pedagogy, but it was part of the aftermath of the kind of student revolution of the 1960s, that we were supposed to facilitate communication and sit in a circle and get everybody to speak up. But the last thing we were supposed to do was to lecture or to embody our own authority as intellectuals, because this was anti-feminist and it was anti-leftist, and I, for a while, kind of followed that advice until I realized that it was the advice that became prevalent in the academy just when women and people of color got PhDs. And then I thought, how convenient. They were all being told
to abdicate
our authority and have no public role. And that we're telling ourselves that we have basically erased ourselves from any kind of public role that involves intellectual authority. So my big determination as a young scholar, young graduate student even, was, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be as audacious as I possibly can get away with. Like, my first book was about this obscure war, but the subtitle of the book is The Origins of American Identity, which people are like, how can you say that? Who do you think you are? I'm like, I don't know, I got my PhD, I can say that. But I will say my very, very dear colleague, when I was an assistant professor, my dear colleague Bruce Schulman, who's a 20th century political historian, who was a chair of the search committee that hired me, made a little poster for me on, do you remember goldenrod photocopy paper? Mm-hmm. On that goldenrod photocopy paper, and he put it up on the wall in my office for me, and Bob Dallek, the presidential historian, Robert Dallek, lovely man, was in our department notionally. He lived in Washington, and he came up like twice a year to, I don't know, give a lecture when he had an appointment at our department. And we never saw him, and we all liked him, but Bruce made me this poster that was a picture of Bob Dallek's face. And it said at the top, would Dallek do it? And at the bottom, be like Bob. It was like a political campaign poster. And he said, Jill, whenever anyone asks you, what are you writing about? Or would you serve on this committee? Or will you run this errand for me? Would Dallek do it? Which was the most support. Like, I would just highly recommend the making of such a poster for all your junior powerless colleagues.
This is the anti-do everything.
This is be like Bob.
Wow. Okay, I've been given the sign that we have about 5 minutes, so here's an easy one. Is Trump a political aberration?
Yes.
This comes from John. Is Trump a political aberration, or, putting aside his amoral behavior and likely indebtedness to Russia, a lot to put aside, a political norm in our history?
Trump is a political aberration. I mean, I guess it depends on who comes next and after him, whether he's a new line, but I think he's an aberration. I wrote a piece for The New Yorker last month that was super fun to write, because I was asked, was when, it's like, it will seem like a decade ago, but do you remember when Paul Manafort
I remember him. It was back in July, right?
Right. Okay, this was like 3 weeks ago. I'm not kidding. And who else? Michael Cohen or whatever. It was like there were a few guys and people were like, this is it, it's now. So I was asked if I could write something about previous administrations where there had been indictments. And so I was looking around for crazy people who were indicted in presidential administrations who were close to the president, presidential aides who'd been indicted. And there are some great guys, including there are like 3 guys named Orville. And I just think, like, you should be called an Orviller when you do that. But I came across a citation in a bibliographic dictionary entry to a book by C. Van Woodward called Presidential Misconduct or something. Oh. And I pulled it, I raced to the library, I was on my bike, And I raced to the library and I pulled it off the stacks, and it hadn't been checked out except for like twice since 1974 when it was published. And what it was during Watergate, John Dean and the Watergate Inquiry Commission, a lot of the Republicans said, okay, Nixon has done all this crap, but we think this is probably what every president does, we just don't know that. So we're not gonna be voting to impeachment unless you can prove to us that this isn't just politics as usual. So Dean called up Woodward at Yale and said, can you compile a report, I mean, maybe it is politics as usual, on what every president who's ever been accused of anything, or anyone in his administration of doing something illegal, what have they been accused of and what happened in the accusation? So Woodward called up like his 3 best friends who called up their 5 graduate students, and compiled this group of 14 historians, and they assigned all the presidents, and they had like 3 weeks to do it. And they all went to like Bill Leuchtenberg's barn in Connecticut or something and like lived together. Just sounds like the most fun in the world to research everything that any president had ever been accused of, fast. So they wrote this report and they rushed it down to Washington, but then Nixon resigned. So it wasn't even published with the Watergate official proceedings because it never entered the government record. But it was a matter of public record, so Woodward owned the copyright to it, so he got it printed, and they printed a bunch of them, and then nobody bought it because after Nixon resigned, everyone was like, don't talk to me about presidential misconduct. So this is a long answer to this good question. But so I called up all the historians who are still living, who had worked on that report. And because Woodward wrote this long introduction in which he said, okay, there's been a lot of Orwelling in American history, but there's never been this, and this, which is the things that Nixon uniquely stands accused of, and in fact has been proven to have done. And so Woodward wrote this very like anti-Nixon thing, like if this had been on the report. So I called all these guys and I said, all right, well then since between 1974 and now, like what's the difference now? Because there's been a lot of shenanigans. I mean, I think Bill Clinton really stands out as a very bad presidential administration. Yeah. In history as well.
In history, sorry.
Yeah.
And in the book.
But so these guys, like I think Leuchtenberg is now 97. I talked to Bill McFeely, who's in his 80s, he's like 85. And all these guys were like, no, yeah, you can kind of respect Nixon. like asking them about Trump, they're like, the thing with Nixon is, Nixon really understood the Constitution. He just didn't think it applied to him. But there was something about attacks on private citizens in a public forum that, while not unconstitutional, is debasing to American politics. Like, if you make a list of those things, right? And that's what Leuchtenberg and McFeely were just floored by. You know, you can listen to the Nixon tapes, and he will say dreadful things about, Dan Ellsberg or whatever. Or it's not like but he's not calling for political assassination, essentially. So yeah, I think we can but hope that this is an aberration.
So at the next meeting of the American Historical Association, will you call together the most prominent historians to do an updated version of this book?
Would anyone?
I think people would read it.
Would they?
I think it would not sit in the library.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much.
All right, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Can I get you to sign my? See, this is.